Good morning, everyone. Welcome in the third and last keynote session of the DN24 conference. I am Geoffroy Patriarche. I am a professor at Université Saint-Louis, Brussels, and I am also a member of the local organizing committee. I will serve as a chair for this morning session. It is my pleasure to introduce you our keynote speaker of the day. Professor Augé is principal lecturer at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He holds a doctorate from Ecole des Hautes Etudes en Sciences Sociales in France. He also worked at the French embassy. He has been a partner in a film production company, and he focuses now on teaching strategic mass communication, film studies, and science fiction. He is the author of several books on propaganda, the Middle East, and cinema. He also serves as a regular trainer in intercultural communication and public diplomacy at the Diplomatic Academy of Clingendael in the Netherlands. We didn't have a lot of presentations so far on public diplomacy. Emma Bryant yesterday addressed this issue in a keynote speech with a definitely critical perspective on it. Professor Augé's presentation might provide another point of view on public diplomacy that is also informed by his own practice in the field, and that will certainly feed the debate of today. Before giving the floor to Professor Augé, I would like to remind you that you can ask questions to him using the Q&A box of the live event. There might be some time before the question you sent is actually published online. This is because the system requires me to kind of validate your question in order for it to be visible to everyone. But I will keep track of your question, of course. So now I give the floor to Professor Augé for a lecture titled True Enough, Propaganda and Reality in a Streaming Era.
Thank you very, very much, and a great morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be here, although I'm not here per se. I would like to start with two stories. First of all, two personal stories. And the first one, we have to go way back in 1994, when I was still an undergrad and I was speaking to my French professors. I was doing a school called Sciences Po in France, and I told them that I wanted to study propaganda. And those two very French professors told me, why do you want to study propaganda? This is it. The Cold War is over. We won. There won't be any more propaganda. Even at the time, I kind of knew that propaganda wasn't dead. But the second story actually happened this year. I ran a course at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, in which I deal with propaganda and other strategic mass communication. And the day before the exam, I received an email from a student, obviously panicked. And she says, hey, Etienne, I know that you provided this definition for propaganda, but I Googled it, and Google says something different about propaganda. Actually, you don't have the same definition. So which one should I go for? And I was a bit puzzled. I didn't know what to say, to be honest. So my best answer was, well, maybe you should check on Facebook and ask your friends. The thing is, propaganda today is not dead, far from it. But we can see, and I'm sure that many of you, when you teach, you also see that we have to fight many things in education. And one of them is indeed propaganda, or what I will call later on true enough. Now, propaganda for me, it was said before that I wrote books about it. I would love to have live discussion with you about the proper definition of propaganda, but for me, I call it the control of beliefs. Now, I'm very much aware that there are several different types of propaganda, different definitions for propaganda, but I use the control of beliefs because what I'm the most interested in is understanding why, in the end, we will have a conversation based on belief and not on facts. And I think it's something that you have to do about other people, but also about yourself. And when it comes to beliefs, I'm also trying as a professor to understand my own belief. Now, I lived in the Netherlands after living in Lebanon, in the UK, in California, in France, in the Slovak Republic. And I can see how my beliefs sometimes will clash with other people's beliefs. For instance, now in the Netherlands, it is a monarchy. And being French and Swiss, for me, it's very complicated to believe that you can run a country properly if you're a monarchy. And I was very interested, just like I think most of you, if not everyone, about Brexit, about what happened with Brexit. Because for me, it was a wonderful case of propaganda. And I would dare to say a modern mythology. The way the Brexit was sold was for me a modern mythology. And it was a question of belief. And I was analyzing this, and I was trying to explain also to my students what happened with Brexit. And I say, well, you can find several elements in Brexit, in the Brexit campaign, in order for people in Great Britain and the UK, but mostly England, to vote for Brexit, to vote in favor of Brexit, which is something I believe that many of us do regret. I don't want to bring this this conversation on the political level, but Brexit sounds like something quite sad. But fear was used, of course. Fear was a very important part of this mythology. And for instance, fear, immigration will continue to be out of control, said the papers that were pushing for Brexit. And Turkey is one of 5 new countries joining the EU. Can you imagine? Turkey will join the EU. The barbarians are at the gate. Now, the Daily Express, for instance, was making it very clear, in very good propaganda style. It's your choice, the EU or NHS. Vote Brexit or we'll lose health service. One-stop doc. Now, I'm not completely sure what the doc is, but anyway, fear. The other major element, of course, was ignorance. And when it comes to the EU, you can see that in Britain, people don't know much about the European Union. Well, they are sort of newcomers compared to the Dutch, the Belgians, to the French, to the Italians. They're newcomers in the European Union. But it seems that according to a survey that is made often by the European Commission, in Great Britain, people score very low in the barometer, in the Eurobarometer. They were asked 3 questions. First of all, the EU consists of 28 member states. The members of the European Parliament directly elected by the citizen of each member state, and Switzerland is a member state of the EU. And it seems that in the United Kingdom, if you can see on this graph, the United Kingdom didn't score very high. Pride also, of course, pride as a wonderful virtue word to make sure that people will rally behind you. Pride. This used to be the British Empire, and now it's the British Commonwealth. It's not as powerful as it used to be. So the element of pride also was part of it. And the campaign in favor of Brexit say we'll be in charge of our own borders. Finally, in a world with so many new threats, it's safer to control our own borders and decide for ourselves. We'll be free to trade with the whole world. So the whole idea of regaining pride, and also to a certain extent, I think the slogan was perfect to summarize the whole campaign. Take back control, as if control was something that was lost at some time, at some point, and had to be regained. Now, this slogan was very nice, but also it had to be pushed by personalities, because in a good propaganda campaign, you also have to use a few techniques, which I'm sure you're aware of, one of them being appeal to authority. And so appeal to authority, in that case, you need some people that will back what you say, and people of importance, people of authority. And for instance, Liz Hurley, former model, who said, if it means we can go back to using decent light bulbs and choose high-power hair dryers and vacuum cleaners, if we so wish, I'm joining Brexit for sure. Now, of course, maybe she's not exactly a figure of authority for many. So the next blow came from cricket legend Sir Ian Botham. I think this picture is from South Africa. But he says, we have lost the right to govern ourselves, to make our own laws and to choose who comes here. I thought it was interesting that the picture is in Cape Town when we actually obviously speak about the destiny of Great Britain. But again, personally, I'm not a fan of cricket. I don't understand anything about cricket. So I wasn't convinced so far. But what really convinced me of Brexit was Sir Michael Caine. And when I saw that he too was supporting Brexit, I really felt like I was hesitating. Should I also support Brexit? Because Sir Michael Caine is in favor of Brexit. And also John Cleese. John Cleese was in favor of Brexit. I don't want to be run by a bunch of European bureaucrats. It seems that John Cleese is not aging very gracefully. Now, also to push the belief in a Brexit, to push the belief that Brexit will be a good thing for the great people of the UK, there were a lot of card stacking. And for instance, part of the campaign was to say, well, we're gathering many people from all walks of life, which are going to convince you of the need to go for Brexit. And one I find the most interesting, sorry, just going back, is actually this historians for Britain. So I went on the website to see who are those historians for Britain, because I'm a historian. I also love Britain very much, but I wanted to see what kind of people were supporting the idea of Brexit. And so on the website, you can see top 10 fun facts about the European Union by Brian. You probably know Brian. He's a very well-respected historian in the world. And about the author, nothing. But this is what Brian was saying about the European Union as a historian. Fun fact number 1, tongues of fire. There are 24 official languages used in the European Union, which means that it requires a lot of translating, meaning that we spend a lot of money on those 24 different languages. You see where he's going. You see where Brian is going. And also I wanted to reassure people, top 10, the fact number 10, fun fact number 10 about the European Union, it won't be the first time that a country is actually removed from the European Union. For instance, French Algeria, when it became independent in 1962, it became independent, therefore withdrew from the European Union. Also, Greenland is not part of the EU since 1979, meaning it can be done. It can be done. Now, there was also a lot of computational propaganda, which is something that is emerging fast, in a sense that propaganda is still the same. Again, what my French professor was saying is just not true. There's never been as much propaganda as today, and computational propaganda is one of the many ways to run propaganda, one of the new media that, of course, we have to use when it comes to propaganda. But it made me question one thing, which is how does England perceive itself? And I put England like this, not Great Britain or the UK, but England, because it seems that mostly this campaign was addressing people of England. And we know that the vast majority of people who voted in favor of Brexit were from England, apart from London, and Wales, and absolutely not the Northern Ireland or Scotland. So how does England perceive itself so that a campaign like this, based on pride and ignorance, would be so successful? And also, how is England perceived in the world? How do we perceive England? Now, it was said also in the introduction that I am training diplomats on a regular basis in a place called Clingendael in Netherlands. And Clingendael is a think tank, but it's also a diplomatic academy. And I'm very happy because for the past 8 years, I was able to train diplomats in intercultural communication, but mostly in public diplomacy. And so we have diplomats coming from all over the world. This place is not a secret, far from it. It's discreet, of course, because it's a place where we try to have what some people might call Chatham House rules, meaning that what is happening in the room stays in the room. But I train those diplomats in public diplomacy, which, as the name indicates, is public. So I would be very happy to discuss this and to also explain why I believe propaganda is a tool and not just something that might be threatening and something that we have to fight. I do believe that propaganda is a tool and it's also essential. I think Aldous Huxley says something along the lines that propaganda is something, it's like water. You have to actually be able to use propaganda and not fight it. So public diplomacy, when I start defining public diplomacy, I said that the USIA, which, as you probably remember, was an independent agency until 1999. Now it's part of the State Department. Public diplomacy seeks to promote the national interest of the US through understanding, informing, and influencing foreign audiences. But again, this is, of course, an American definition. And we have diplomats coming from all over the world, except probably the United States, Russia, France, Great Britain. So I'm always trying to find a definition that would be more in par with what the diplomats are expecting. And I say, well, my definition is seduction of nations. It's the seduction of nations. But the great thing about working with so many different countries, so many different cultures, is that everybody's got a different perception of seduction. Clingendael sent me to Abu Dhabi 2 years ago, and I used the term seduction, and one of the diplomats was looking at a dictionary because he didn't really understand what it meant. And another diplomat from South Africa some years ago, when I say seduction of nations, she looked at me, she said, so French. So I'm not always using seduction. I say, well, actually, to go back to what's interesting for us today, public diplomacy is propaganda applied to diplomacy. But once again, for me, propaganda is not something negative. It's the control of beliefs. It's something that is essential. And maybe there's something that we can call good propaganda, and maybe it is public diplomacy. My goal when I am training diplomats in public diplomacy is to help them be able to tell the story of the country better. As such, I do not believe that public diplomacy is something that will be harmful. It's actually a tool in international communication to have your story be brought out in the world. So propaganda applied to diplomacy is also one of the tools that we use is place branding. And place branding is an interesting concept. It's measuring, building, and managing the reputation of places like countries, regions, cities, and anything that you cannot really change. In a sense that branding, usually, when you speak about branding, you will speak about branding, for instance, for a can of Coke. So if people do not like the color, I can easily change the color of Coke. If people don't like the font, I can change it. If people don't like the taste, I can change it. But when it comes to changing the reputation of a place, a country, a region, or a city, it's much more different in a sense that if you don't like Paris, I cannot completely destroy it, terraform it, and rebuild a new Paris. So we have to work with what we have. We have to work with what we have, and also we have to work with stories and also with beliefs. The point is to get the story of the city, of the country, of the region out there so that people will be attracted to it. Now, the first element, of course, is to measure the place branding. And measuring place branding for this, we're using several index. And to be honest, since I'm speaking mostly to people in academia, I'm not completely sure about the scientific seriousness of those index, but still. The first one comes from the Reputation Institute, and I've been using that for a few years. And Reputation Institute has been surveying 58,000 individuals in 7 countries, and their purpose is to provide a ranking of the countries which have the best reputation. Without further ado, here they are. The first one is Sweden, followed by Switzerland, Norway, Finland, New Zealand, Canada, Denmark, Australia, Netherlands, Ireland, Japan, Spain, Austria, and Belgium. Now, when I use this index, I always tell the diplomats, if you look at all those countries, they have a few things in common. They're not there for, it's not a coincidence. The Reputation Institute is usually considering countries which have a good reputation in the sense of they don't have a reputation of being warmongering. All those countries are very stable, and they also consider to be good neighbors. Sweden, for instance, is neutral. Same for Ireland. Japan is supposed to have only a defense army. Although it's a powerful army, it's supposed to be a defense army. All those countries are perceived to be good neighbors. And it's important because the Reputation Institute is placing Sweden, Switzerland, and Norway as the top 3 countries with the best reputation. But if you look at another index coming this time from an alliance between Portland, which is a PR firm from the UK, Facebook, which I'm not going to present, and the UEC Center in Public Diplomacy, which is probably the most important center today in terms of research on public diplomacy, but also training, well, they have a different way to look at the best reputation, or at least at country branding. And for them, the best is actually France, followed by United Kingdom, Germany, Sweden, United States, Switzerland, Canada, Japan, Australia, and the Netherlands. If you take those index, you can see that it's always pretty much the same countries which are in the top 10 or top 20 or even top 30 or top 50. But of course, the order will be different. The ranking will be different. For instance, another ranking that is used, Future Brand Country Index 2019, this time it's Japan. Reputation Institute placed Sweden as number 1. Portland placed France as number 1. Future Brand is placing Japan as number 1. Once again, always pretty much the same countries which are in the top 10 or top 20. Now, Bloom Consulting is also interesting for us in the sense of how we're going to perceive this kind of propaganda of nations, because they have 2 different rankings. The first one is about trade. Since public diplomacy has to seduce people, it's always going to try and target certain categories, especially investors, students, and tourists. And you're not going to attract them the same way. You're not going to attract them with the same story. In a different word, propaganda should be different for different type of people. So Bloom Consulting, Country Brand Ranking Trade Edition. I place here just randomly Asia ranks to show you the difference between the trade and the tourism. Bahrain, for instance, will be very high. It will be one of the highest ranked country in Asia. But if you look at the other one, which is about tourism, the Azerbaijan will be actually the highest one. Now, what I like to do when I speak to diplomats and also to anybody who's got an interest in the difference between perception and reality, beliefs and reality, is this. Perception versus reality. I came across another very interesting ranking. I do repeat that those index I am using, but I would say I'm using mostly for PR purpose. I'm using mostly to say, look, you have a ranking saying that Sweden is the number 1 country in terms of reputation. I am not completely sure about the scientific value of those rankings. But what about this one? The 10 most beautiful countries in the world. And it's something that's been published in the past years. And in 2020, they gave us once again the winner of the most beautiful country in the world. And I wish I could see you. I wish I could also know where you're all coming from. But the most beautiful country in the world today in 2020 is Scotland, followed by Canada, New Zealand, Italy, South Africa, Indonesia, England, Iceland, USA, and Wales. These are the most beautiful countries in the world. Now, this kind of ranking was released in many major newspapers. I remember I saw it in the New York Times. And when you see a ranking like this, of course, well, it might strike you that Scotland is the most beautiful country in the world. I've been to Scotland, and I would agree that it's one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But one of the most beautiful, I would like to know, says who? Who is actually saying that this is the most beautiful country in the world? And actually, most newspapers reported about the ranking, but also about who sent the ranking. And it was the rough guides. Now, again, if you're in academia, you know that you have to be very careful with this, and you want to know the methodology. And so how did the rough guides actually end up with this ranking? And the rough guides say, well, we ask our readers, which country do you believe the most beautiful in the world? And based on the answers of all the readers of the rough guides, they came up with this wonderful ranking, placing Scotland as number one. But if we go back a little bit, maybe we can see where the readers are coming from. Wait a second, Scotland, England, Wales. It seems that most of the readers, and it's actually true, most of the readers of the rough guides are coming from the UK. As a result, obviously, they know their countries quite well, and they will place them as high as possible. And the other countries are countries which traditionally are very accommodating to people of the UK. I felt a bit vexed, and although it was interesting that France, for instance, was not part of the top 10, because usually when you speak about tourism, when you speak about attracting people with a story, you speak about France. In reality, actually, France is the number one country in the world for international tourists. France is one of the very few countries in the world which has more tourists than inhabitants. 86 million people visited France in 2017. We speak about international tourists. And I think in France, 67 million people live in France, plus 2 million abroad, including myself. But that's one way to consider France, because actually the true winner of international tourism, and it seems that it's not a very well-known fact, is the United States. The United States is by far the biggest country when it comes to international tourism. But when I do this training in public diplomacy and ask diplomats, well, which country would you say is the number one in tourism? And I of course, I keep the question very vague. I say, well, which country is number one in tourism? Some people say France. Almost nobody is saying the United States. That's also the thing about perception and beliefs and facts. And sometimes this phenomenon called cognitive dissonance can happen, because I would say, well, United States is actually, if you look at the numbers, the United States is by far the biggest juggernaut when it comes to tourism. And some people disagree with that. Some people disagree with something that is not a stat, that is not a survey, that is actually a very hard figure, because it's coming from the UNWTO. And the UNWTO is surveying international tourism every 2 years, I believe. And they say, well, actually, the United States is number one in the world. But it's not how the US is perceived, which I find interesting considering the amount of money that the United States is spending in public diplomacy. The US is spending at least $5 billion just for public diplomacy every year, just for public diplomacy. Actually, the real figure is probably 4 times this, okay? It's closer to $20 to $25 billion. But it seems that although the US is spending a vast amount of money on public diplomacy, they're not perceived as the number one country in any of the survey, any of the index that we're using for public diplomacy. Now, countries like the Netherlands, which I am right now where I work, are actually doing better in terms of value for price, in a sense that the Netherlands is always in the top 10. And if the US is spending at least $5 billion every year in public diplomacy, the Netherlands is spending only 5 million euros. Now, the rankings today, I am using, and I'm also telling the diplomats to use them, because again, I do not believe, and I think it's probably the 10th time I repeat that, I do not believe in any scientific value for the rankings. All of us today, we are submitted in our universities to the rankings, and it started with Shanghai 10 years ago, and now we have the ranking from Leiden, we have QS, we have Times of Higher Education. The rankings today seems to be necessary to organize the information, because we can see that there is an overload of information. I think what my French professors didn't see coming was this hyper-information, the fact that today there's so much information at our fingertips, and we have something called smartphone, which honestly make us more stupid. I don't even know my own phone number. When people ask me for my phone number, I have to check in my own phone. So it seems that this phenomenon of hyper-information is something that they didn't see coming, and that is spreading more and more and more. And in order to organize information, well, ranking is a good way to organize information, because what is the most beautiful country in the world if you Google it, you will probably find that it's Scotland. So where do you get the right information? Where, if you're looking for the right information, can you find it? That's also where propaganda is very powerful, because it's going to mix the truth and the false and the beliefs and wrap them up. And in the end, it will be mostly the source that is important and not so much the information. I am sure that everybody here is using Wikipedia. I use Wikipedia. I like Wikipedia a lot. I donate to Wikipedia, €5 here, €5 there. I like Wikipedia a lot, but I can see that when in a course you speak about a topic and students want to check it, they Google it. And as you probably know, Google is not going to provide you with the right information, but the most popular or the one that is paid for. And one of the first answer will be Wikipedia. Again, I like Wikipedia a lot, but I think it's also funny to see what Wikipedia is doing with information. One day I was looking for information, the birth date of a country singer I like a lot. I like country. And it was interesting that the same page, Wikipedia was giving 2 different date of birth. Now, we know about Wikipedia. We know that, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation on Wikipedia. And several studies have been run about what is the most accurate between Wikipedia and Britannica. And Britannica claim it's more accurate than Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is probably faster. Well, I checked, for instance, if I was referenced in the French Wikipedia, and I am referenced under propaganda, but also under shawarma. Since I wrote a book about Lebanon, I am used as a source on shawarma, which makes me very proud. If you don't know what shawarma is, it's delicious. It's a Lebanese sandwich. But Wikipedia is not exactly the place where information can really be organized. And so the concept I'm working on, stemming from propaganda and hyperinformation, is true enough. And I think Wikipedia is true enough, in a sense that it doesn't have to be true as long as it's true enough. In a sense that if you're looking for information, you don't want the precise answer to this information. You just want something that sort of corresponds to what you are expecting. Sorry. Now, true enough, in the world of propaganda, in a world where public diplomacy is also something that countries have to practice to attract investors and students and tourists, of course, Hollywood is playing on this true enough, because Hollywood is going to provide us with images of countries, and sometimes it will be positive, but most of the time it will be very negative. For instance, the Borat effect. Maybe you remember this movie. In 2006, Hollywood released a movie called Borat, and the movie is about a journalist who is a complete idiot, misogynistic, anti-Semitic. He's really a complete idiot. And he's coming from Kazakhstan. Now, the problem is, the whole movie claims that it's a journalist from Kazakhstan and he's going to the United States, he's behaving in a very weird way and very aggressive. And the thing is, it can be very funny if you're not from Kazakhstan. Obviously, people from Kazakhstan didn't like it because it didn't reflect very well on their countries. The thing is, the movie is not about Kazakhstan, but it's true enough. It can look like Kazakhstan. If you've never been to Kazakhstan, it looks like Kazakhstan, true enough. Except the movie, all the sequences taking place in supposedly Kazakhstan were shot in Romania. And the actor is not even from Kazakhstan. Sacha Baron Cohen is from London. Okay, he's a well-known London comedian. And so there's nothing about Kazakhstan in this movie. But in the end, when I'm, for instance, with diplomats from Central Asia, and they come from Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, usually the one from Kazakhstan say, yeah, well, the problem we have is that people still identify us with Borat. And if you're not convinced by this, maybe I should remind you of an episode that happened in Kuwait in 2012. 2012, there was a competition, athletic competition in Kuwait. And the one person that got a medal, that won a medal, was actually from Kazakhstan. And I don't know if we can hear the music. I'm not completely sure. But when you get a gold medal, what's happening is that they're going to play the national anthem of your country. And this is precisely what happened for this athlete. They played the national anthem of Kazakhstan. Now, I don't know if you can hear it, but it's actually not the anthem from Kazakhstan. It's the anthem of Kazakhstan from Borat. What happened is that the good people in Kuwait, they were not expecting that lady to win the gold medal, so they were not prepared to play the national anthem of Kazakhstan. So they Google anthem Kazakhstan, and they found this one, which is openly making fun of Kazakhstan. But again, it sounded true enough. I think all of us, we know our anthem, maybe the anthem of our neighbors, and most probably the US anthem. But who knows the anthem from Kazakhstan? Obviously, not the people that were organizing this session in Kuwait. Now, the opposite is also true. In public diplomacy, something that is called the James Bond effect. The James Bond effect is the exact opposite of the Borat effect. So the James Bond effect, as you probably know, James Bond, the job of James Bond is to be a salesman. He's the worst spy in the entire world. If you want to be a spy, from what I hear, you got to be a bit discreet, a bit secretive. And James Bond is anything but discreet. When he's there, you know it. And actually, even the villains call him Mr. Bond. But he's a great salesman. I put here the picture of a Rolex. Rolex appears as product placement even in the books. If you read the books of James Bond, you can see that the author, Ian Fleming, is referencing Rolex as saying, it's the only one for James Bond because he's an active man. And when he punched someone in the face, only Rolex is strong enough not to be broken by a jaw. In the movies also, he's a great salesman. For instance, in GoldenEye, he's driving a BMW Roadster. And I believe that after the movie was released, it was in 1995, the sales of the Roadster went up 300%. So the thing, James Bond is actually a huge commercial. It's a beautiful commercial, glamorous commercial, very expensive one. But the point is to sell products, but also to sell countries. And many countries actually strike deals with the production of James Bond in order to have a James Bond feature in their country, because every time James Bond is going to a country, tourism is also surging. Tourism is also going up, because if a Rolex is good enough for James Bond, then it's good enough for me. And if James Bond has a great time in Jamaica, then maybe also so should I. Now, what I wanted to say with this, with public diplomacy, and the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about public diplomacy, is what I usually explain in Clingendael, which is that propaganda is a tool. When you say propaganda today, you know that most people will not use propaganda anymore. If you speak about propaganda, you're going to, most of the time, accuse someone of doing propaganda. And today you will use mostly different terms like public relations. We know that basically Bernays wrote propaganda in 1928, but later on he coined the term public relations because propaganda was a dirty name. I don't agree with this. I'm very much in favor of giving their true meaning to the words. And for me, propaganda is a tool. It's a tool of strategic mass communication. It's something that has to be used. And most of the time, it is used probably for the wrong purpose. But I do believe that propaganda, when it's properly used, can also be a tool that is going to help people, and especially in that case, to help countries. Propaganda, for me, is absolutely necessary. We cannot get rid of propaganda because we cannot get rid of beliefs. As much as I would like to believe that human nature is rational, that we are rational when we are taking a decision, the simple observation shows that we are not rational. And maybe it's a good thing. It's probably a good thing. So propaganda in that case is necessary to control the beliefs. And when I say control the beliefs, it can be control the beliefs, control in religion, it can be in politics. But in that very case, in the example that I wanted to develop today, I don't have a lot of time, of course, but I wanted to show and hopefully start a discussion around the fact that propaganda can also be a very important tool, and that instead of fighting propaganda, it will be more important to actually in classes, in schools, in university, to help people identify propaganda. Now, I use some techniques that I'm sure you're aware of. I used card stacking, I used the appeal to authority, and many others that I'm sure you heard of. But the idea of propaganda should also be something that I believe should be taught so that people can identify propaganda. And if they are able to identify propaganda in a certain point, they can also choose their own propaganda and maybe even use their own propaganda. Now, that's all I have for you today. I was very, very happy to be able to run this conversation. I wanted to also maintain my presentation as short as possible so that maybe, hopefully, we can have some questions. Back to you, Geoffroy.
Thank you very much, Etienne, for your talk and for sticking in the time frame that we agreed upon. So that's perfect. So that means also we have quite some time for the discussion, and we already received several questions. So I was trying to gather them and to try to 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 tell a kind of story using the different questions in a different order than the way we receive them. And I would like maybe to get back first to the very definition of propaganda, because this is something that apparently has also triggered some questions.
I was expecting that.
Yeah. One of the first comment or questions maybe that I would like to draw your attention upon is the one from Luciana, who thanks you for the talk. And also she asked, okay, you emphasize a lot the notion of belief in relation to propaganda. And she was asking what role for the opinions in that structure?
What
for you, is opinions and beliefs the same, or is it something different? And if opinions are different than beliefs, then how do you deal with the relation between propaganda and opinion?
No, it's a very good question that, of course, I cannot completely answer here. But indeed, for me, opinions are a form of beliefs and also information. It is my understanding now of human nature that, again, not being rational, I mean, you know that we could have a lot of talks about echo chambers, about many different things that I'm sure you also discuss in other sessions. But I do believe that opinions, indeed, opinions are difficult to sway because they are absolutely based on beliefs in the sense of how we're raised and what we embrace. And many of us, unfortunately, we tend to sort of reinforce our beliefs. We're going to read newspapers which sort of correspond to our beliefs and our opinions. So for me, opinions are based on belief and also solid information. But of course, we choose those information. Card stacking for me in propaganda is one of the most interesting techniques because it's something that we even see in academia. As much as I would like to say that we practice something called social science, we may have a scientific approach to knowledge, definitely. But there's also a lot of things that we select and refuse to select. So we do card stacking, and our opinion, of course, has a very important part in when we write a book, when we write an article, or for this talk or anything. So for me, opinions derive from beliefs, and belief is something that propaganda is going to control, that maybe it's not even organized. But when you come from a society, for instance, I come mostly from the French society, although I lived in many different countries, but it is my belief that food is extremely important, that you should take time for food. In the Netherlands, people believe differently. So I never argue with Dutch about food. We just agree to disagree because we have different opinions. But it's a very interesting question about this idea of opinions, in a sense that can you actually change opinions in debate, or can you just do point scoring? So I cannot really answer completely because it's a whole huge debate. But for me, very quick answer, opinions derives from beliefs.
Okay, thank you, Etienne. So I hope this provides some bits of response to the questions from Luciana. Another question that is related to the notion of beliefs comes from Anonymous. He or she is asking, when you say propaganda is closely connected to beliefs, that can be problematic. Well, it's actually both a comment and also a question. So it's not every conversation based on belief. Isn't every conversation based on beliefs, not only in politics? And especially in politics, you cannot really speak about facts. Or is it wrong to relativistic approach? In that case, we have to choose the position we support and to give up on ethics here. That is, good, bad propaganda. So it's kind of several comments and questions in there. So maybe you can have a look on your own on the question itself. So it's one of the first one you receive in the Q&A box.
Okay. I don't think I have access to the Q&A box for now because my screens are already very busy. Okay. But just to answer once again, I think we all understand that propaganda is a massive topic, and that also on propaganda we'll have different opinions, also based on different beliefs. So propaganda is a passion of mine. It's something that also is explaining a lot of my interest, in a sense that when people ask me why do propaganda and science fiction, at first, I had no idea, but now I understand, because for me, science fiction is a way to actually destroy propaganda. Propaganda it's black or white. It's 1 or 0. When science fiction is what if? So this question, I think, is crucial, but I would like to answer with a French joke, which was back in the day, there was a stand-up comedian who would say, well, 30% of car accidents are caused by people which are drinking alcohol, which means that the rest is provoked by people drinking water. So it means that drinking water is actually more dangerous when you drive than drinking alcohol. It makes complete sense. But there's no sense at all. It may be logical, but it doesn't make sense at all. So this idea of opinion, the whole thing about belief is that, well, indeed, when we discuss politics, even if we want to stick to the facts, for instance, look at what's happening with COVID. I can see that the debate is different depending on the country, and that some politicians are going to use what they call hard facts with COVID to justify politics, but they're going to select those facts. So the thing is, depending on what they want to show, how they want to develop the opinion of the citizens, even if they use facts, they're going to choose those facts. And that's also part of propaganda. In a sense, you're going to control the belief of the receiver by using different types of facts. And even if those facts can be checked, of course, you're going to discard the facts which are not going in the direction that you want to push people. So this second question, which again, I cannot access, so maybe I'm doing something wrong on my computer, but I absolutely agree in a sense that it's another, the first question was a whole debate. The second question is also another debate in a sense that I do believe, and I use the term believe, I do believe that we can have a conversation. We can have a good conversation between people which are informed and in good faith and so forth and so on. But I'm also a scholar, and I know that in many academic conferences, you can take 20 experts which have been working on the theme for 30 years, and they will still disagree. Why do they disagree? Probably because they have different ways to look at the topic, because they also use different facts and so forth and so on, and because, well, at the end of the day, we might be in academia, we're also humans, and therefore irrational. I believe that we have to be honest. What is for me the most important is honesty, in a sense that if you discard a fact and you know that what you're doing, then you're not honest. And for me, it's not about ethic. It's about pure honesty, in a sense that I'm not asking anybody to try to be rational, neutral, objective, or anything. I don't believe that we can. But I do believe in honesty, in a sense that when I was talking about public diplomacy, I also explained to diplomats, well, this is what we're going to do. And I remember a few years ago, a diplomat asked me, are you going to teach us to lie? And I say, well, hey, you don't need me for that. And no, I'm not going to teach you to lie. For instance, Morocco, you don't have to say that you have the biggest economy in Africa. But maybe you can actually point to the fact that you have most probably the most developed mass transportation system in Africa. So you see, selecting facts is something that we constantly do because we are telling a story. And at the end of the world, what works the best in communication is stories. So for this question, once again, I don't want to take too much time. It will be a whole different debate. It is a very legitimate question, just like the first one. But like you say, it's a bit of a comment and also a question in the sense that this would be a great trigger for a whole article, book, or anything. But indeed, I believe, well, opinions derive from beliefs, big time. But in that case, when we have a conversation with people, indeed, many things are at stake. And many of those things are irrational. Is it still possible to have an informed debate? I believe so, provided that we are honest. And it also means to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Etienne. And also in relation to what you just said, I have here another question that also deals with the concept of propaganda. And as you know, you have here an audience of researchers that for many of them, they have a background in discourse studies. So they have Michael has a question about the notion of propaganda and the notion of discourse. So I read the comment from Michael. He's saying this: I am unsure why you are organizing your ideas under the concept of propaganda rather than discourse. Some of your examples do not sound like propaganda to me. They lack the intentional element. They sound more like discursive mechanism. For example, your idea of true enough in relation to Wikipedia. How do you think the two concepts, discourse and propaganda, as you use it, are related?
I have no idea. I really don't know. I'm sorry, but if we want to open Pandora's box about how we call things differently, I don't know. If you believe that it's actually discourse, I really don't have a problem with that. For me, this is propaganda in the sense that I provide a definition of propaganda at the beginning, and from there I organize what I do, not only on theoretical level but also on practical level. It was mentioned before that I worked in an embassy. I did. I like it very much, and we were doing something that is cultural diplomacy, and the nickname for it was the propaganda division, for sure. So I'm speaking, of course, from a research point of view, but also a practical point of view, in the sense that this is what I did and this is what I train people to do. So honestly, this for me is not really a question. It's a comment. Like you would probably say, Michael would say, well, I call this discourse. You call it propaganda. I don't know how to answer this. For me, it's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem. So if you want to call it discourse, it's perfectly okay, Michael. I don't have a problem with that.
I think that in Michael's comment, there was the notion of intentionality. That was also a key aspect. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on it or not.
Well, notion of intentionality is something that has divided people working in propaganda for quite some time, in a sense that is it still propaganda if you don't know that you're practicing propaganda, in a sense that if at some point you actually repeat what you heard somewhere and that you're not critical about it, is it still propaganda? It's a very open question. So again, discourse, I don't know. I'm really sorry, but I come from different background as a historian, so it's not something that I use often. I would love to know more about it. Don't get me wrong. But when it comes to intentionality, it is indeed an open question. Now, for me, the thing is, it opens a different question, which is more about being critical. In a sense that if we don't question also our beliefs, if we're not critical, then we are part of it. We're also guilty of this propaganda, to say the least. So intentionality, like there's a movie I use when I teach called Forrest Gump. And it's a very complex movie because I've been showing it to my students for 10 years. And every time I say, well, have you guys seen Forrest Gump? And actually, I asked them that 2 days ago. I have a new batch of students, wonderful students, very, very smart and very open. And I say, have you seen Forrest Gump? Yay! Did you like it? Yeah! And I say, well, I'm going to explain it to you in a way that maybe you won't like anymore. And the biggest question about Forrest Gump, which is a movie that is, I would say, if today you consider the movement of Black Lives Matter, and you watch Forrest Gump, it's a bit scary because basically Forrest Gump is saying, well, okay, well, for 40 years we had some problems with African American, but let bygones be bygones. And when they represent, for instance, the Black Panthers, in the movie Forrest Gump, the Black Panthers are always aggressive and they seem pissed off and they yell at the white man and so forth and so on. When the Black Panthers were organized in a way that was mostly protective. And of course, there was probably some violent elements, but they are not represented the right way in Forrest Gump, to say the least. And it goes to the point that the ancestor of Forrest Gump is actually a well-known general that during the Civil War was part of Dixie, and later on became one of the main figure of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's treated as a joke. Now the question about Forrest Gump, and it's still an open question, I discussed it with many people, is it the intention of Robert Zemeckis to do this kind of propaganda that is sort of wiping out African-American history from the official American history? Or is he doing this because he's not critical about his material? So once again, third question, and I understand the context we're in, which means that we're not supposed to come with definite answers. I mean, if at some point I have the exact answer to my questions, I think I will probably quit my job. But the notion of intention, for me, is still something that is widely open, in a sense that if you take Forrest Gump, to me, it is part of a conservative propaganda. I'm not sure Robert Zemeckis is openly conservative, that is even supporting some elements of the Republican Party. But when I'm watching this movie, I can see a lot of elements of propaganda, like card stacking and many of them. But yeah, it's an open question for me. And I would love to discuss it with Michael or anybody else. Is Forrest Gump intentionally doing a propaganda work, like some examples in history, like the Green Berets, which was an open propaganda example? Or is it something that Robert Zemeckis doesn't think about, is not critical about it, therefore it's not his intention, but at the end of the day, he's also part of a very conservative propaganda, erasing African-American history from the official American history. So you see, again, I'm sorry about the idea of discourse, and I know also it's part of the whole theme of the conference, but it's not something that I'm going to use. Maybe I should use it, but in the concept of intention, for me, is indeed crucial. And I'm sorry, I might be a scholar. I don't have a definite answer for this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Etienne. There are well, actually several questions that ask you to elaborate a bit on when you say, for instance, propaganda is essential. Well, it is essential for whom, actually? There's also a similar question by Jan asking when you say, Etienne, that the concept of true enough characterizes propaganda. Well, who actually determines it's true enough? Yes, and also Johannes has a question that is very similar, that when we say, for instance, we need to use propaganda, who is actually the we in question? And this is also in relation to what you said later on in your presentation about the fact that in a sense we should all use, be able to use and identify propaganda. So who is the who, and also what is the perspective from which you are talking when you say that it is essential?
Okay, very legitimate question. Indeed, well, when I say that propaganda is essential to societies. All of us come from different cultures and different societies, and the thing that is binding us in a society is the story. And most of the time, those stories are actually mythology, and they're not completely true. I take an example that I take very often. So I'm French, but also Swiss. And the thing is, Napoleon, for instance, in France is worshipped, is l'empereur. You don't even say Napoleon. Napoleon, you say l'empereur. But for the Swiss, Napoleon is not exactly a great figure, far from it. My grandmother was Swiss German, called him a bloodthirsty vampire. So if you want to be part of a society like the French society, it will be difficult for you to bash the figure of the emperor, because we, the French, were made of different stories. And as you probably know, France is complex, just like any country. It's made of different tribes and so forth and so on. And the only thing that is uniting the French is actually the stories. And those stories, many of them are beliefs. Like when you study history in France, you're going to study the story of Saint Louis. He's one of the few kings that we actually call Saint Louis. So we don't call him by his official name, but by his Vatican name. And so if we want to live in a society, if we want to have common values, they have to be based on the same stories, the same mythology, and same beliefs. An author I like very much, and I use very often, is Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell wrote a lot about mythology and explained, for instance, the story of the monomyth. And he says that the monomyth, if you look at all the different cultures, all different societies, I'm not speaking about countries yet, all of them have a myth, central myth, which is the myth of the hero. And of course, the hero is somebody that we're going to glorify. Maybe he was just a human being in the beginning, but later on, he will become a hero, an example, somebody who sacrificed himself for the nation, somebody that we have to emulate. So when I say we need propaganda because we need beliefs. There's not a lot of things that we know for now. Honestly, if we look at the amount of knowledge we have, even at university, we don't know a lot. If you take the crisis of the COVID, for instance, right now, you can see that there's not a lot of things that we know even about how viruses are spreading. When it comes to climate change, the same. When it comes to history also, I really regret that history so far is taught with the stories of kings and queens and battles and things like this. So knowledge is still to be organized. We don't know much. And when we study history in an official school, most of us went to a school like, a French school, American school, or whatnot. We learn about the history of our society so that we can also fit as citizens. And we also learn about the values and things that we can do and things that we shouldn't do. So when I say we need propaganda, I would say, if you prefer, societies need propaganda. Now, of course, maybe some human beings are Übermenschen in the world. They are overmen and they don't need propaganda because they're completely rational. And I would like very much to meet them. Probably it exists, people which are entirely rational, only base their life on facts and question every time their beliefs and so forth and so on. I have yet to meet these people. So when I say we need propaganda, it means, first of all, societies need propaganda because they need stories so that they can spread their values and bind their members together. And also as human beings, because we are humans and we don't know much, whether we're in academia or not, we need beliefs because we need hope. We need certain concepts that are hard to define, but hope is one of them. Like our life will become better and the life of our children will be better. And hope is a story about the future. And it's a story that hasn't happened yet and may probably never happen. So does it mean it's a lie? No, it's not disinformation, but it is propaganda because it's a belief. So this notion that we can actually use propaganda, look, propaganda exists. Propaganda has been there for as soon as we organize societies. So let's say, I don't know how we can sort of sell this, but probably for 5,000, 6,000 years, propaganda has been there. And it's been existing ever since we need to organize societies. So propaganda is there. We may regret it, and we can say, well, we're going to fight propaganda, but most of the time we do fight propaganda with another propaganda. If we don't like a story, we're going to use a different story. If we're against a belief, we're going to use a different belief. So my whole point here is to say, well, since it exists, I do believe in informing people, educating them. The the first book I wrote about propaganda was simply called Tree of Propaganda for those who are suffering from it and who want to prevent themselves from it. So my point is not to train propagandists. My goal is to actually explain, well, this is propaganda. These are the techniques used. These are some examples. And that's what I do in the sense of I believe in education, or else I wouldn't be at university. But I do believe that we need propaganda. It's a belief. And I use that term knowing that I'm using belief because, well, it's also a belief in the sense that I would love that somebody proves me wrong. And maybe somewhere there's a human being who is completely rational, who has not a hint of belief, not a hint of propaganda, but I still have to meet that person. Until then, I will base my work and my research on my observation, on my experience, and what I know about propaganda. And so far, I can say that indeed societies need propaganda, and the best way for me to deal with propaganda is not so much to fight it. And again, maybe something I didn't mention loud enough, propaganda is not disinformation. I don't want to enter the whole fake news debate. I don't think that, well, fake news is a debate I don't want to be part of, but disinformation is when you are using wrong information on purpose. Propaganda is the control belief, meaning that you're manipulating information which could be true or cannot be proven wrong. And it makes it way more complex and also, for me, way more interesting. So I'm not in a debate on disinformation. Disinformation is different. When you lie to people on purpose, you know you lie. We go back to what I was saying before, which may sound extremely naive, but you're not honest. You're not being honest. And about propaganda, I tend to consider that most people practicing propaganda, whether they're priests, whether they're politicians, whether they're scholars, are honest and truly believe in what they do. But again, this whole thing about saying, well, propaganda is for the mass and educated people will not suffer from propaganda is something interesting, especially since when Jacques Ellul wrote his book about propaganda, he already mentioned that people who believe that you will not be affected by propaganda are the easiest target of propaganda. So for me, societies need propaganda to control their beliefs. We need propaganda because we need stories. All of us are made of stories. We believe in those stories, whether you believe in God or Harry Potter or anything. It's not rational. It's not supposed to be rational. And ignoring the rational part of human beings, for me, is a massive mistake. And thinking that we are only thinking machines is also a massive mistake.
Mm-hmm. Now there's one comment from a participant that would like to get back on your definition of public diplomacy. Well, actually, the working definition that link public diplomacy to propaganda. So you said public diplomacy is propaganda applied to diplomacy, basically.
Yep.
So I will read the comment of the participant. So thank you for your very interesting presentation. You have a conception of propaganda, which I share in large part, which is not negative and which therefore closely resembles diplomacy, with the notion of seduction that you used. However, I wonder that to what extent it is possible to distinguish them from the interactions to which the two notions refer. That is, the first, propaganda, is often seen in one direction, one informs or deforms, while diplomacy engenders more interaction, more based on communication. Do you have a comment on that, please?
Absolutely. I think it's also a very interesting debate. I can see that the audience is very informed, which I like a lot. It's a very good one because sometimes I argue with other diplomats about this because they don't like the fact I use propaganda for public diplomacy. It's a very good debate because then we have to really be careful about how we define both propaganda and diplomacy. For me, again, I don't think I was a good diplomat because first of all, I was very young and I was, very, very low. Because in diplomacy, the thing is you cannot always say what you mean. And the thing is with honesty, you have to sort of play with the concept of honesty. Now, I agree with you that diplomacy should be about bringing people together through dialogue. But the thing is diplomacy also, and especially public diplomacy, is characterized by the fact that you also want the best for your society, for your country. And as such, you're going to use weapons which are not always for the greater good. Any diplomat, when he's got a choice between representing his people and saving mankind, is going to represent his people. So the thing is, there's also some kind of hypocrisy here. There's always hypocrisy. We are humans. There's hypocrisy in academia, in diplomacy and whatnot. But as much as I think diplomats are wonderful people, they're doing an amazing job. And I say amazing in the sense that today it's a 24/7 job. It's extremely hard because if a diplomat is doing something bad, it can be recorded and be put on Instagram, TikTok, or whatever. but also think that at the end of the day, a diplomat is supposed to hide certain things and to also work for his society, and most of the time for his country. So as much as it is true that theoretically there is the notion of dialogue, a diplomat, especially today in 2020, is also a salesman. And you see, for instance, one thing that I observed when I saw it was a very long time ago. We had the 14th of July, what the Americans call Bastille Day, which is National Day in France. And so we always organize something big in all the embassies. And 20 years ago, France was organizing something with the money of the French. But now, when you receive the card inviting you to the traditional 14th of July, most of the time you will see all the sponsors of the 14th of July, because the game has changed. And today, embassies are also used in the case of France, by French companies to sell products. And the job of an ambassador is also about selling a certain lifestyle, selling the country, selling the product of the country, and so forth and so on. So in that case, as much as it can be a dialogue, in the end, the dialogue should end up with a sale. So I agree that diplomats never agree with me, or people working on public diplomacy for ministries, they never agree with me. They tell me, just plain, you are wrong. You don't know what you're talking about, because diplomacy is about dialogue. Public diplomacy is about dialogue, when propaganda is one way. And again, I have to defend propaganda, saying that, first of all, if you want to be one way, you also have to listen to people. How can you actually touch people and control their beliefs if you don't listen to them? It's not possible. So in propaganda, you also have a dialogue. You have to know who you're talking to. And I think it's essential. And diplomacy, it's also the same. But what I'm talking about for public diplomacy, and for me, there's nothing wrong with selling your values, especially since the other way to sell your values was to invade a country. And it's still something that is done in 2020. But before, that was probably the only way. If you wanted people to follow your values, you speak about the French Empire, the British Empire, all those empires that existed before. Well, in order to have people share your values, you will invade them and force them. Now, public diplomacy is part of what is sometimes called soft power, which I'm not completely sure about. It's a concept that was developed by Joseph Nye. Soft power, basically countries have hard power and soft power. Hard power is when you force, and soft power is actually more when you convince people. Public diplomacy is about soft power, in a sense that you convince people that, for instance, buying a Swiss watch, buying a German car, buying these kind of things is also giving you a piece of values of a country. And for instance, the reason why France is considered to be the country of luxury goods is not based on reality. It's based on perception, because actually the country that is selling the most luxury goods is Italy. But if, for instance, if you do the test between selling the exact same perfume and you say this is made in Paris and this is made in Stockholm, the perception will go for made in Paris, because that's the perception. So in diplomacy, the thing is today, many diplomats would say, probably off the record, that of course they have to represent the country. They do an amazing job because they have to know so many things about negotiation, international relations, cultural sensitivity, and so forth and so on. But also representing countries, and especially countries with a huge economy, the purpose is also to sell a product through a certain lifestyle, through certain values. The Americans have Hollywood, which also we have to be careful, because Hollywood is not controlled by the American government. Sometimes there are some clashes, but it's a wonderful tool of cultural diplomacy. That is, you cannot really predict the outcome. But the French also have an amazing cultural diplomacy worldwide. The French have the second biggest network, cultural network, diplomatic network in the world. The Chinese also developed themselves tremendously with the Confucius Institute. The British have the British Councils. And I would say, honestly, if anybody believes that the British Council or the Goethe Institute exists just because, it's about countries sharing values and being nice to each other, it's also a way to say, look, this is what we have offer in terms of values. And in the end, you will learn German and you like the Bayern of München, and maybe you want to buy the German cars and so forth and so on. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that countries are also economies. And today, it seems that we have less high-intensity conflicts. Actually, we have way less high-intensity conflicts, but it's also replaced by commercial wars. And embassies also reflect this, in a sense that back in the day, the diplomats will be very trained in international relations, but would sort of despise economy. But today, you can see that many ambassadors, their job is to definitely push for commercial products. And those commercial products can be sold through culture. Don't underestimate, for instance, the power of cinema, even French cinema, like Amélie Poulain, which is a movie that is very well done, but sort of harmed the image of France because it made a lot of people travel to Paris and they want to see the neighborhood of Amélie Poulain and so forth and so on. So this movie that is very well done is also has an influence on how France is perceived and how people will buy the same dress as Amélie or this and that, and will have coffee in the place where she has coffee and so forth and so on. So there's also an element that I understand in academia is not always well perceived, which is the impact of money. It's also about money. So diplomacy today is not just about bringing people together. In my opinion, it should be, in a sense that the reason why I still work at Clingendael, and I really like it, is that we bring people together in the same room. And sometimes, I cannot mention which countries, but sometimes those countries are at war, but they are in the same room. And the idea is to speak to each other so that they can also understand that maybe they can have an understanding. But that's not the only job of diplomacy. And as much as I believe it's a very interesting question, because it raised really the question of what should diplomacy be about? The thing is, it's extremely complex. And it's not just diplomacy is just listening to the other and making the world a better place, so forth and so on. It is, I believe so, but there are also other aspects. And in that case, propaganda is useful for a country to sell its products. And diplomats in that case will be like James Bond, salesmen. And I hope I don't offend diplomats at all. I have the utmost respect for them because I know I cannot do that job, but it's also part of the job. And any diplomat that has been working on the field for quite some time know that also is there to push a certain idea. And I would say I would use the term in English, which is to advocate for the country, to advocate for its values, but also for its products. And I don't see anything wrong with this as long as it's done with respect, which is usually I would say the problem.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, Etienne, that would like you to elaborate on the actual success of propaganda in terms of controlling beliefs. So, of course, we already talked a bit about it, but there is there are some stuff you would like to add to what you already said. I will read here the questions by Razika. She says, thanks for the interesting talk. I want to know more about the extent to which this propaganda might succeed in controlling beliefs, and does it always depend on higher authorities to do it? There is another comment, and maybe there are some others, of course, but also Johannes is asking, if propaganda is the strategic shaping of belief, I guess there are beliefs that can be much more easily shaped than others. Everything cannot be engineered, or would you disagree?
Well, first of all, I think it will be the last question because, as you know, unfortunately, I have to run and to teach very soon. And it's really painful because these are very interesting questions. I would love to actually have the conversation with the people asking the question. These are very, very interesting discussion because, again, just like before, we spoke about the intentionality of propaganda, also the result, the effect, which is very complex to measure. First of all, I would say that propaganda, because sometimes I'm going to speak about my students at BA and master's level. When we speak about propaganda, sometimes they tend to confuse propaganda, like before it was say propaganda, discourse, and then the same. Sometimes they say, well, aren't you talking more about marketing? And so propaganda, marketing, advertising. I say, well, it's massively different for me because also there's one element in propaganda, which is time. You cannot really run a propaganda campaign without time. And also, when I was speaking about Brexit as some kind of introduction, understand that Brexit was capitalizing on centuries of propaganda for Rule Britannia, in a sense that they were also using existing beliefs and sort of comforting them and modernizing them. But how do you measure the efficiency of propaganda? Well, in the case of Brexit, I would say it's quite, how can I say, obvious, because I think I also made it very obvious that I was against the idea of Brexit, in a sense that I feel sad because it's almost like a breakup, and maybe it's for the best, probably it's for the best, but I cannot pretend that I'm neutral about this, and I feel pretty sad about Brexit. But I have to kind of salute the success of the Brexit campaign because they did a great job using propaganda, using elements which are completely irrational, but are stories and are based on belief. Like really, the idea that England and maybe Great Britain will be stronger because it will be independent, it makes absolutely no sense. But they didn't play this. They didn't play it this way. They say actually it's about independence, which is also funny when you know the history of the French Empire, the British Empire, so forth and so on, you can see it's quite ironic that they emphasize on the idea of independence. They want to be independent from something that is undemocratic, when the French and the Brits basically control 3/5 of the world. So it's also ironic that they're using certain terms in order to defend a new story, when actually instead of being the victim, they were the aggressor. So the success of propaganda, I would say, well, you can see it takes some time to analyze, and usually propaganda takes a lot of time and also is going to capitalize on previous stories. So it's not easy, I agree. And that's also why I mentioned before, I see propaganda as a historian. So I also tend to consider things from using sometimes centuries or millenniums and so forth and so on. Religious propagandas can also be analyzed in terms of who's going to convert, who's not going to convert, and everything. But indeed, it's not easy. Again, I'm afraid I'm coming here with more questions than answers. I'm very happy about this kind of questions, but for me, they are definitely discussion. The intention of propaganda, I mean, if you actually spread beliefs, and I use the example of Forrest Gump, but I have many other examples. If you spread belief, are you still doing propaganda because it's unintentional? About the effectiveness of propaganda. So the second question, I believe, was about can everything be engineered? I don't know. I'm sorry, but I don't know. In a sense that I would like to work more on certain cases and say, for instance, well, is it possible to engineer a new belief today? Yeah, it is. But of course, it will take tremendous amount of time and also have almost complete control over media, which is very difficult. These gone are the times when Nazi propaganda could control all the media, including especially cinema. Today it's not the same. So that's why also I introduced the idea of hyperinformation, which is a concept well known, I think, to everyone, saying that in that case, because of hyperinformation, because we don't know where to find the right information, propaganda can also be developed differently from in the past centuries. But I would actually like very much to work more on this idea of can anything be engineered in terms of propaganda? I don't have the answer to this. I think it's a very interesting question. I think that if you believe in it, maybe you can find the right story to convince people. But so far, I would say things that we're convinced of, beliefs that we have, again, they don't have to be very rational. I think we can be very much inspired. And maybe I would say also as a form of conclusion, maybe it's time today for more positive stories about the future, because the propaganda that we see today, whether in the United States or France or Great Britain or anything, it's actually quite depressive. So I would actually, if we have to suffer from propaganda or if we have to live with propaganda, I would very much like to have more uplifting and more inspiring stories. And that would probably be the last thing I can say about propaganda.
Yeah, and this looks like probably a very good concluding work for this this session. So we are running out of time indeed. Well, in the name of all the participants, we would like to thank you, Etienne, for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Conference and for this intriguing and inspiring talk. So thank you very much for being there with us. And also, so after the break, we will start with the parallel sessions of today at 10:30. So we hope to find the participants back in those sessions a bit later in this morning. Goodbye to all. See you soon in the other sessions. And thanks again to you, Etienne, for your talk.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.